I don't know how many of you may have read Richard Rohr's book, Falling Upwards, but in it he says this: the task of the first half of life is to create a proper container for one's life and answer the first essential questions. What makes me significant? How can I support myself? Go with me. The task of the second half of life is, quite simply, to find the actual contents that this container was meant to hold and deliver. So I don't know which half of life you may or may not be in, but some words for you there. And Richard Rohr then goes on to quote the famous last lines of Mary Oliver's poem, The Summer Day, which I included in your session notes yesterday afternoon. And those lines are, you may have heard them quoted on their own before. Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Richard Rohr goes on to say that far too many people just keep doing repair work on the container of their lives and never throw their nets into the deep. We heard that phrase in our reading yesterday, or just the bit before our reading, to bring in the huge catch that awaits them. Well, as I said, we've already been thinking over these past few days about miraculous catches of fish, bookending effectively the story of Peter's journey with Jesus. So whether you're in the first or second half of your life, I wonder what that huge catch that Richard Rohr talks about might be for you. What is that deeper and fullest life that's at the heart of your calling, your vocation, at the heart of who you are called to be and to do? What does that huge catch mean, not only for you as an individual, but just as importantly, for the different communities, including your church communities, of which you're a part? I think these are good questions to begin the final session of this retreat, Walking with Jesus, as we think about where we may be going and what we may be going on to in our journeys. I know I certainly don't have all the answers for myself, let alone for you as individuals and as members of different communities and churches. So I would encourage you today to continue to think and pray and listen to God together. Even if you can't meet face to face for a while, meeting in virtual space seems to work remarkably well. I certainly have had a real sense that the Holy Spirit still enables us to be with each other in God's presence, in spirit, as we say. So as you ponder what the world and what your individual and corporate calling and mission within it is going to look like going forward, keep setting aside time to linger with God, listening both in the silence of your own hearts and listening to God speaking to you through one another. I think there may be echoes here of the kinds of what next questions that the disciples may have been talking about with each other and perhaps asking Jesus about as they walked together from Jerusalem to the Mount of Olives, the final leg of Jesus's earthly journey with them before his ascension. Or maybe Jesus had simply instructed them to meet him there and was waiting for them when they arrived. So maybe they were talking on the road amongst themselves. We're just going to have a short Bible reading today, but I'm not going to ask you to go off and pray with it on your own during this session, as I want to allow more time for people to share in the wider group. But I hope you will take it away with you after lunch and continue to ponder it in the coming days. So let's put the reading up now. So, Acts chapter 1. So when they had come together, they asked Jesus, "Lord, is this the time when you will restore the kingdom to Israel?" He replied, "It's not for you to know the times or periods that the Father has set by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." When he had said this, as they were watching, he was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of their sight. While he was going and they were gazing up towards heaven, suddenly 2 men in white robes stood by them. They said, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking up towards heaven? This Jesus who has been taken up from you into heaven will come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven." Then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath's day journey away. Well, even as I was reading that aloud to you, I was thinking of more things that I could say, but we'll not overwhelm you. How do we go forward, facing the unknowns of whatever strange new world is emerging? Quite possibly a world where we're going to have to learn to live with coronavirus, COVID-19, and some of us are going to continue to die from it. As we ponder where our walk with Jesus may be taking us in this context, there are just a couple of things I'd like to draw out from this reading that you might like to take away with you. The first is simply the question, what is a Sabbath's day journey? Now, when I chose this reading, I was thinking, we started with a reading about walking the road to Emmaus, which was obviously quite a long way. And I thought, yes, we'll end with that verse that talks about the disciples walking back to Jerusalem. But this Sabbath's day journey wasn't the distance a person could cover by journeying for a day in normal circumstances. But as some of you may know, actually it was a unit of distance, about 2/3 of a mile, just a kilometre, that the Jewish leaders limited people to journey on the Sabbath, deeming journeying any further to be work. Mount Olivet, of course, is known as the Mount of Olives. I haven't been there myself. I would love to go one day. I don't know whether I ever will. But as those of you who've been may know, it's located directly east of Jerusalem across the Kidron Valley. There's maybe something in that pondering of a Sabbath's day journey that resonates with some of the coronavirus lockdown restrictions relating to work and exercise that have been part of our lives over the last few months, and the continuing, albeit constantly changing advice coming from government over the easing of the lockdown. Perhaps this reading also ties in to some of the other things that have been hardest and saddest for so many people about lockdown. The being physically separated from friends and loved ones through social distancing, grandchildren not able to see and hug their grandparents, and most especially for those who've not been able to be physically present with family members ill or dying in hospital or care homes. For those, as you were talking earlier, who've been unable to attend a loved one's funeral because they've been forced to self-isolate or because they've simply been too far away and can't travel. It makes me wonder in a new way how the disciples might have felt as they slowly walked back to Jerusalem on their own after Jesus had disappeared from view. I don't know quite what that was like, watching him disappear from view. When I went for my early morning walk yesterday, I spent a lot of time looking up at the sky, into the heavens, and just, it's so vast, the sky above us. But how did they feel as they walked back without him? I don't suppose it was quite like the acute grief and fear they'd felt after Jesus' death. After all, they'd subsequently seen him on a number of occasions over a 40-day period after the resurrection. But I think that perhaps, as for anybody trying to come to terms with the loss of a loved one's physical presence, it must have been quite hard, very hard even, to accept that they were no longer going to be able to see him face to face. Another thing perhaps to draw out from this reading are the questions the disciples ask Jesus right at the beginning, when they're saying, Lord, when's it all going to be sorted out? When's the kingdom going to come? How long's this all going to take? Again, some of the kind of questions that we have found ourselves asking over these months, and will continue to ask. How long, O Lord, how long? And thinking about Jesus's response to them, it's in the Father's hands, that sense of having to settle for the not knowing. But perhaps the key thing to draw out from this passage, especially as we look forward to Ascension Day next Thursday and the Thy Kingdom Come season of prayer leading up to Pentecost, is Jesus's promise of the coming of the Holy Spirit. Here is the assurance that though the disciples may no longer be able to see Jesus physically, they're not going to be on their own. He's not going to leave them. He is going to continue to be very much present with them and us through the presence of the Holy Spirit. And not only present by his Spirit, but also empowering his beloved friends through the Spirit, then and now, to be his witnesses, sharing the good news of the gospel of God's love for us. Here is the answer for the disciples of the how do we do it? How do we go forward question. That very simple reminder to them and to us, we know it, but we still need to hear it again, that we can't do anything in our own strength. We all need God's breath, that wonderful word in Hebrew, ruach, God's Holy Spirit filling us, inspiring and strengthening us to face the unknowns of whatever this new world is going to be like, and to be able to find new ways of sharing the gospel and making his love known. I think there's something rather poignant and profound in reflecting on that idea of the breath of God in this season of an illness that so affects people's ability to breathe and literally takes their breath away. The disciples went back to Jerusalem to wait 10 days for the coming of the Holy Spirit, their own mini lockdown, if you like, but a new kind of waiting. And then the Spirit came. Let's really use this coming season of Thy Kingdom Come through Ascension Tide to wait and to pray expectantly, both for God's Spirit to be deeply at work in our lives and the lives of all those we know and love, but also that the Spirit will come afresh to the church and to our even more needy and fragile world in these days. Well, that's just a little bit of something to get you going with that reading, perhaps. But that's enough for me now. I just wanted to give you a few pointers that may or may not be of help. But you'll find the passage in your session goodie bag, along with various other bits and pieces of prayers and poetry that you might like to use to pray with at some point. But as I promised yesterday, we're now going to take some extended time to share in the wider group with one another and think about what might be the one thing, or perhaps it's a couple of things, that each of us is going to be taking away with us from this week.